Well, this subscriber says artists on YouTube talk about varying color, but I don't know what that means. I know you can make color lighter and darker. Is that what they're talking about? I just don't see what the big deal is. It's not a big deal, it's just something you can do. Well, the whole business of varying color is just because that's what nature does, really. We look at a color and we call it something, but as artists, it helps if we can see the little innuendos that are going on within that color. For example, on a pair of blue jeans, you might see a blue that kind of leans a little bit more towards green where the light's shining. But where it's in shadow, you might see a blue that's leaning a little bit more towards purple. So there are all kinds of things that go on in color, and we still just call it maybe just a single color. Well, I want to show you how you can go about that and what varying in color is all about. I'm going to start just with a simple tube color. Everybody's familiar with burnt sienna. Now, burnt sienna by itself, if you call it burnt sienna, you don't know a whole lot about it. And you don't know a whole lot about how you can vary it. So my way of working is always to refer to what hue is in the burnt sienna. The hue is what makes the color. Without hue, you don't got no color. So, burnt sienna. Now, this is burnt sienna I have on the palette right here. And if I just this is just a little end of a 3x5 card. And if I just put some of that on the edge of the card, some burnt sienna on the edge of the card, a lot of people just call that brown. Brown's not a hue. Brown is a color of a sort, but it's not a hue. The next thing I would do if I wanted to find out what hue is in it, I then go to the color wheel. And I find an area where it feels like it might belong. See, it doesn't really feel like it belongs to yellow. It's feeling a little bit more like it might belong to yellow-orange, and a little bit more to orange, perhaps to red, but a red-orange. So what I can do then is I can create a lighter version of that. Now this is varying with value. So if I add a little bit of white to it, and paint that on the other end of the little piece of cardboard, I can see that that is leaning over here towards orange and red orange. Now that tells me that yes, I can vary the value, and the value itself of just burnt sienna, I don't have to show you this, you know it, starts with the value that comes out of the tube, and yes, I can make it lighter. And when I begin to make it a little bit lighter, yes, I vary. So there we have a variation of the orange, the red orange, or burnt sienna, if you want to call it, as it comes out of the tube. And then we can get it lighter and so on. And that is variation. But there are other ways we can vary it too. Here, whether it registers as red, orange, or orange, these are its neighbors. And I can add any of these neighbors to it and vary it and keep it pretty much in the same color range. So for example, one of its neighbors is, as we move around, we can see some yellow just within the vicinity of it. And so if I add just a tiny bit of yellow in that mixture, it's no longer burnt sienna. It begins to lean now just a little bit more towards yellow. So just a tiny bit more. Leans now, and that is variation. And that is what you would see right here. You see a slight little yellow coming through. That's what you would begin to see when the light would begin to shine on that color if you saw it. If I add a little bit more of the yellow to it, I vary it some more and mix that yellow in really, really good. And look what we have here. Let me pull the paint out of the brush so we can get a quick reading of that. This is varying the red orange or the orange in burnt sienna. I keep calling it either red orange or orange because some brands of burnt sienna will actually be orange, and I'll show you how they get that way in just a moment. But right now we just know they live somewhere in this vicinity, and as long as it's in this vicinity, if we add any of these warmer colors to it, we're going to vary the hue. And so if we add the yellow, there we go. There's another variation. Now you might see that complete range in a single thing, say a bale of hay, like the previous quick tip was about, or anything that falls in that range of color, leaves on the ground, especially in the fall, you might see that kind of variation. And so what you would do there is simply add a hue into it, and then you can have all the values of that hue. So now if after adding the yellow to it, if I add white to the yellow, and I still have a variation. So you see we have that long variation there of just a change in hue. I could change it in hue in the other direction and have the same variation. So one way that we vary color is to vary the hue. And we discover how we can vary the hue by referring to the color wheel. You don't need one of those fancy color wheels that you have to pay an arm and leg for. All you need is a simple traditional color wheel. We have them free on the website at DianeMize.com. Go there, get a PDF of it, print it, and you've got it. So that varies hue. Now we can vary more than just the hue by adding colors that are not analogous. Analogous is a word we use when we're talking about neighbors, colors that are neighbors. But if we start moving from one set of neighborhood, or maybe let's say move from one neighborhood to the other things happen, but it's still variation. Now, let me show you. Before I do that, I want to show you one more thing. I want to show you that another way we can vary the burnt sienna itself is to add another orange to it. I wanted to show you that. So if I come down into a highly saturated orange and add it into the burnt sienna, then I get this kind of variation, which is a higher saturation of the same hue. So that too is varying. And then we can continue to add more of that highly saturated orange to it, and we keep moving until we get a fully saturated orange, and this is a variation of orange. But you can see now that it still all fills in the same family. Now we can go back to how did it get to be burnt sienna? How did that burnt sienna hue of this burnt sienna, how did it get to be so desaturated? Now that is the other thing we can do to vary. And that is if we start out with a really saturated, and saturation means it has all the hue in it that can be possible. And when it starts losing hue, it starts leaning more towards this sort of hue, where we don't see as much hue in it. We call that more neutral. People also say less intense. They'll also say chroma, that it loses chroma. But just say saturation, and that tells you something about how much hue it has in it. That is varying. So then, if we're varying in the direction of saturation, we can do it in one of two ways. How I just did it, we could create or reach for a tube of the same hue, but less saturated. Just like I did here, we have the more saturated version here, and we have the less saturated version here. Or we can reach for a complement. Complements live on the opposite side on the color wheel. And so if we reach for a complement, here we go, of the orange, if I reach for the complement of the orange, and I would reach for blue, in this case, I'll just use ultramarine blue, which is close enough to the complement. And I need to, before I do that, if I want to keep it varied, but keep it pretty much in that same value range, I'll need to raise the value. It's called value correction of that blue to be the same value. Now this is variation as well. Now watch. This will vary pretty much like that did. So if I add a little bit of blue into this, then it begins to lose its saturation. That is varying. A little bit more to make it a little bit more obvious. You see, and you can vary it just a little bit, or you can vary it a lot. Let's just brush out because I want to be sure I don't get any of those other colors in it. So I rinse my brush out really, really good, and I dry it really, really good. Now I'll reach for this, and here I have a slightly desaturated orange that started out fully saturated and now it's slightly desaturated. Now that it's varying. I can vary the saturation, and I can pull some more of that blue into it, and it becomes even more desaturated, or we could say less saturated. That is varying. We're varying the saturation. So let's wipe this out so I can pick up so you can see exactly what happened there. There we go. You see, there is a varying saturation. Now notice what happens there. We can vary the saturation. We don't have to get it darker to vary the saturation, but we can vary the saturation by doing what I did here, by creating a value of the complement that's a similar value as the color we're mixing it into. Now, do you see the similarity now between this and this? All of that is just varying saturation. And whereas this is varying hue, and we're varying that hue, or this is varying hue, where we're varying the hue from the orange towards yellow. Here we're varying the saturation, and here we're varying the saturation. Here we varied the saturation from a color that came out of the tube, more desaturated, but we're varying it towards a stronger saturation. Now we're doing just the reverse. We're varying from a strong saturation into a more desaturated version. And so that if I take it one more step and I get, see, even a stronger or a less saturated hue, it's still the hue of orange, although now it's losing so much orange it almost loses identity. So we vary the hue by adding another hue into it that's its neighbor. We can vary the saturation by adding the complement or another color that has some of the complement in it. And then we vary the value. Now, I talked about the value just a little bit in the beginning, but each one of these, we can vary the value. This can be varied light to dark, lighter to darker. This can be varied lighter to darker. All these can be varied lighter to darker. And so if we, for example, if we use the orange by itself, pull it down like this, and we add the burnt sienna into it, like we did there, for example, we're varying value. We're varying, so in this case, when it gets darker, it's going to get desaturated. But we can vary the value in the other direction as well. Some of this probably seems quite obvious to you, but if you think about the concept of varying and how we do the varying to make the colors in our paintings read with more depth and more, you might say, more of a richer response of what we're seeing, then we can give ourselves that freedom to change that hue as we're moving in one direction or the other. And so any of these can be varied lighter. Here is the orange itself going lighter. And that too, that is value variation. And we can gradually take it gradually, get it gradually lighter by adding more white to it. And we have the gradual change. Now there's one little thing there, especially the color of orange. You'll notice if I put just a touch of yellow into that mixture, it stays more orange and becomes less pink. See the difference there? All right, so play with that variation of ideas. Start out with a single hue, or single tube color, I should say. You could reach blindly into your collection Start out with a single hue color, tube color. Identify its hue first, because if you just call it, if you just work with it with the tube color in mind, it doesn't tell you anything. Most of the tube colors don't even have the hue that's in them listed on the label itself. So use that as a way of identifying what you're buying. But when it comes to painting, identify its hue. Very important. You will see that will give you so much more freedom when you're painting, and you get that variation going in most of those colors instead of just adding the darker or the lighter to it. It gives you a much richer painting experience.
Be sure to view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com where I have full length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.